A few months ago, the bowl of my mom's bird bath fell off the base and broke. I decided to make a new one myself so that I could play around with some new techniques I'd been interested in trying. My plan was to use a CNC router to carve a mold for the bowl and then pour concrete into that mold to cast the final bowl. I've been playing around with a new CAD program, Autodesk Fusion 360, and this seemed like a pretty good opportunity to use it on a more substantial project. I started by taking a photo I had of the base of the existing bird bath and importing it into Fusion. Then I traced around it to make a 3D model of just the base. After I had the base, I traced a profile of what I wanted the bowl to look like, and then revolved that to turn it into a 3D object. That let me make sure that the size and style of the bowl matched the base. I wanted to add some sort of decorative feature to the bird bath so it wouldn't just be a plain bowl that was the outcome of this whole complicated project. So I created a vector graphic of some leaves, brought that into Fusion, and applied it as a raised pattern to the bowl. I did that by creating a thin shell around the bowl itself, and then extruding the graphic down to intersect with that shell, and just keeping the parts that intersected. After that, the model itself was pretty much done. Then I had to take the model and turn it into a mold by creating a negative version of it, and then that negative mold is what I would carve on the CNC and pour concrete into to create the end result. The material I wanted to use for the mold was 2-inch thick foam insulation board. The mold as I designed it was thicker than that, so I had to slice the mold into slabs that were no thicker than 2 inches, and then position those slabs so that I could cut them out of a single sheet of foam. Once I had the mold parts laid out, the next step was generating toolpaths for them, which is telling Fusion which tools I have for the CNC, inputting a bunch of parameters, and then letting it generate the actual paths that the tools will travel in order to carve out the model. I wanted to do a couple tests to make sure that the whole process, from model to CNC cutout to mixing to casting concrete, went smoothly. So I made a scaled down model with some of the features of the bowl just to get a sense of how the process was going to work. Someone suggested that I use a special type of concrete called countertop mix, which is meant for very thin applications, where instead of casting 4 or more inch thick slabs of sidewalk, you can cast much thinner pieces like countertops without them breaking. That first test cast came out okay. The bottom surface had sort of a weird texture and a lot of bubbles in it, and the very bottom never hardened completely and sort of had a clay-like consistency. I thought it was because I maybe hadn't mixed the concrete well enough, but I wasn't 100% sure. Also, the foam on the inside of the bowl was really hard to get out. The concrete's texture wasn't as smooth as I hoped it would be, so I knew I would need to do something to make that surface finish better, and also to make it easier to pop the concrete out of the mold when it was done. After that, I did one more test carving of one part of the actual final mold, just to make sure that I had all the settings and tools figured out. That one worked pretty well, but there were still a few things I changed afterwards, so I'm glad I did one last test before going through with the final thing. I added a pencil toolpath around the leaves to clean up the edges a little bit, and I moved the initial roughing pass up vertically about 0.2 of an inch so that it wouldn't leave these concentric circles on the inside of the bowl. From start to finish, the full job took about 3 hours. A lot of that was changing tools and making last-minute tweaks. The actual machining time was probably about 1.5 hours. I probably could have optimized a little bit more, but for a one-off job, 3 hours wasn't too bad considering how much time I had put into the project before I even got to that point. After everything was cut out, I was happy to find that all the parts fit together how I hoped they would. I used silicone caulk to glue the bottom 2 and the top 2 parts of the mold together, so that left me with 2 halves of a mold that went together at a single seam. I did some light sanding on the surface to try to smooth out any rough spots. I'm not sure the sanding actually helped more than it hurt. I managed to rough up the foam in a few places, so I'd probably just skip that step next time I do a project like this. Then I caulked all the seams and imperfections so that I would have as smooth a surface as possible before I poured the mold. The next day, my mom came to the shop to help with pouring the concrete. We put a thin layer of Vaseline over the whole surface, which I thought would help fill in any remaining rough spots and also make a nice lubricated surface so that the cured concrete would pop out instead of sticking to the mold. I put a short length of vinyl tubing into the mold to create a drain hole so that my mom wouldn't need to tip the bowl over every time she emptied it to clean it out or refill it. Normally the hole would be stopped up with a plug, but my mom would be able to remove the plug when she wants to drain the water out. I put the 2 halves of the mold together with a single bead of silicone around the edge. I didn't want to make it too hard to pull the halves apart after the concrete was done curing, but also I wanted to make sure that there was a nice smooth finish along that seam. I clamped the whole thing together with a couple nylon straps. I was a little paranoid about the whole thing breaking apart under the weight of the concrete, but luckily that didn't happen. I used a cordless drill to mix the concrete and water together, which was sort of a bad choice, but it was the only drill I could find that had enough torque at low RPMs, so I was just sort of apologizing to the battery and the motor as I was using it. After I poured the concrete into the mold, I used an electric sander to vibrate any air bubbles up to the surface. The concrete was really watery at the top, which made me worry I had undermixed it again, but I wasn't really sure what I could do about it at that point, so I just made sure it was as full as possible, so if it evaporated or crumbled off at the bottom, there would still be enough material left. The last step before leaving it to cure was to put a short bolt into the bottom surface. The bolt would have a little knob threaded onto it, which would stick into the base of the bird bath so that the bowl wouldn't be able to slide off. And after that, it was ready to cure. After about 24 hours, it was time to open up the mold and see how the cast turned out. And it pretty much worked. The very bottom of the bowl didn't cure quite right again. This time it was more crumbly than clay-like. Someone at the shop mentioned that I should have had the whole thing covered with a plastic sheet to prevent water from evaporating, so I'm pretty sure that's why I had those problems with the exposed surface. It didn't turn out to be too big of a problem, but at least now I know for next time. The inside of the bowl was very dark. I think it was discolored from the Vaseline, but it was really evenly discolored, which I guess is a result of how evenly we coated the inside of the mold. The tube I put in for the drain hole slid out, which wasn't that big of a deal. I wasn't sure if it was going to do that, but I just epoxied it back in and it was fine. I packed the bowl up and drove it up to my mom's for the final installation. I cleaned the whole surface with mineral spirits and a stiff brush. The bottom of the bowl, which had looked a little chalky before, looked a lot better after that. The inside of the bowl was still very dark, but it looked pretty good because it was still very consistently colored. We moved the base, which involved some digging and re-leveling with pavers. I'm afraid it might start to settle or tilt a little bit over time, but we'll just have to keep an eye on it. Then it was finally time to install the bowl on the base. We filled it up with water and tested out the drain, which worked great. My mom was very happy with how the bowl came out, and hopefully the birds will be too.